This session will explore what's at stake, and it's quite a lot, as freedom of the press diminishes around the world. We'll also look at the new ways that technology can further democratize expression. We'll hear from journalists and activists on the front lines and other advocates who are working to defend their rights. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Pat Mitchell. Many of you probably know Pat, but may not know that early in her career, Pat was a journalist and a war correspondent. She was covering conflicts in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, and El Salvador. Then, as the head of CNN Turner Productions, Pat produced literally hundreds of hours of award-winning documentaries from the front lines. And as the first woman president of PBS, she commissioned even more journalists and storytellers. Now, as a nonprofit leader, she serves on the boards of Sundance, Participant, and the Skoll Foundation. The last thing you need to know is that Pat is also the author of a forthcoming book called Becoming a Dangerous Woman. But I'm not so sure about the becoming part. And with that, I think you know what I mean. Please join me in welcoming this terrific panel, Pat, Joel, Yvette, Anas, and Jason.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. We are living in dangerous times, that's for sure. So it's probably a good time for all of us to become a bit more dangerous. Certainly a lot bolder and braver. And especially when it comes to speaking up for the truth and how critical it is that the people who bring us the truth, who bring us reliable, trustworthy information, the facts that are necessary for life-saving opportunities and activities, as well as sustaining free and open societies everywhere. And the people that we know who do that most, who are on the front lines of this day in and day out, are the journalists. And we are really privileged to have this group of people who are taking this threat to journalism, which has certainly escalated in these dangerous times, taking it seriously and looking for solutions. We're going to begin, as we often do at Skoll, with personal storytelling. It's always the best way into understanding just how serious the threat is. Jason Rezaian knows very clearly and personally. He is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. Tehran in Iran was his station, and he was arrested unjustly and imprisoned for 544 days. He was released in January of 2016. See,
good old days.
The good old days of 1916, yes. And has written about it compellingly in a book called The Prisoner. This morning, Jason, would you share with us what that experience, of course, what it was for you, but also what you emerged thinking and believing as a dedicated and committed journalist?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. This is a very important subject and one that I unfortunately know pretty well. I never, when I set out to be a foreign correspondent, assumed that I would become one of the poster children for attacks on free expression, but here I am. And I wear that badge proudly now, because it's such an important aspect of our modern life, and one that's under threat. I come from San Francisco. My father was from Iran. He immigrated to the United States in the late 1950s. My mom is from suburban Illinois. So typical American is how I would describe myself, mixed background. And in the mid-2000s, I decided that I wanted to work as a correspondent in Iran. I had studied journalism and creative writing in college. This was my passion. This is what I wanted to do. And I took the sort of surprising step of packing up all my belongings and moving across the world to Tehran. Reverse family migration, almost, and not a very common one. And from right off the bat, I had the opportunity to write extensively for a variety of publications, starting in 2009. I was, for several years, the only US citizen working as a journalist on a permanent basis in Iran with state permission. I was hired by the Washington Post in 2012. And everything was sort of moving in a forward direction. For the first time in my lifetime, the US and Iran were engaged in very direct negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. It was seemingly a new day in relations between Tehran and Washington. In the summer of 2014, those negotiations were really reaching a climax. I was reaching a stride in my work. My wife was a foreign correspondent as well. She's born and raised in Iran. And just 3 days before we were about to make a trip back to the US for some well-deserved R&R, we had some strange activity on our social media and email accounts. We've been hacked into. This was July 22nd of 2014. That morning, I went to the press and ministry to complain about this activity. And they told me, not only are you not under any sort of threat, here are extensions of your press accreditation for 1 year for you and your wife. So I went home and I told my wife everything's okay. We can continue to work. There's nothing to worry about. We were packing our bags and planning to go to a surprise birthday party for my mother-in-law that night. And as we were leaving our apartment building, we exited the elevator into our garage, and as the doors were opening, there was a man standing there with a gun pointed at my head, with 2 other plainclothes security officers with him. They were both masked with surgical masks to hide their identities. They pried their way into the elevator, took us back up to the apartment, ransacked our apartment looking for we still don't know what, took our devices, forced us to relinquish our passwords, took all forms of our ID, and then hauled us off to an unmarked van with tinted windows, blindfolded us, handcuffed us, and took us off to Evin prison, where I would spend the next 544 days. From the earliest moments, my wife and I were separated, put into solitary confinement. The interrogations began almost immediately. I was being accused of being the CIA's station chief in Iran, which was a ridiculous sounding claim, and I told them so. But it didn't seem to matter. Anything that I said, any defense that I had for myself, just seemed to make the hole even deeper. I had no news of my wife for the first 35 days. She was also being held in solitary confinement. Ultimately, she went on to spend 72 days, all of them in solitary confinement. And then she was released, and her right to work as a journalist was stripped from her. She was forced to move back in with my in-laws, give up our home, unable to communicate with the outside world. Her movements around Tehran were followed. But fortunately, she's fearless and had become a dangerous woman at that point, and was a relentless advocate for my release, along with my big brother, who Joel got to know pretty well, and my mom. And I think, from the very beginning, I had all of the resources that a journalist in trouble could want working for them. A committed family, a committed employer in the Washington Post, friends and allies in different media organizations, and the entire community of press freedom advocacies working on my behalf, and a US government that was, whether or not they were committed on day one, were forced into taking care of this issue. And it still took 1.5 years. There were a lot of twists and turns in the road. I was put on trial in what they call the revolutionary court. If you find yourself on trial in a court that has revolutionary in its name, you know the outcome before you get there. It's not good. And it was just an incredibly trying time. I was cut off from the world, in isolation in the entire year and a half that I was there, first in solitary, then with one other cellmate. No access to the internet or newspapers or the ability to communicate with anybody besides my wife and my mother, who were allowed to visit me periodically. So it's a very isolating experience, and one that 3 years after my release still has a lot of lingering effects. And ultimately, I'm one of the happy endings. And so when I think about so many of the other stories that Joel and other organizations have covered and continue to advocate on, I feel a deep sense of responsibility. So as a columnist for the Post, I've returned to full-time duties and find myself writing about these cases around the world. And as some of you may know, maybe you don't, press freedom stories are not traditionally big news. And fortunately, I think all of us up here are trying to make it bigger news and explain to people why it matters. For me, I worked in the same newsroom on the same very tiny section of the Washington Post that Jamal Khashoggi wrote for. I was just getting to know Jamal personally when he was murdered in the most unfathomable way. And for the second time in my life, it brought home to me the importance of our right to expression, the risks that we take to protect that right, and the importance of the wider public thinking about this, because it's something that we've all come to take for granted deeply. And I don't think any of us up here are going to let you do that after today. So that's me.
I think there's no chance that anyone will do anything other than take this threat very seriously and to deeply appreciate what you endured, but also now your strong advocacy for your own freedom to practice journalism, but to protect those of others. I'm going to come back in just a moment for another personal story, but Joel, because Jason referenced you and the Committee to Protect Journalists a couple of times, and many of us know how critical the work is that you do when journalists like Jason are in those kind of dire situations. But could you just step back a moment and give us a sense of how broad, how wide, how deep, how terrifying this situation is for journalists?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much, Pat, and what an incredible opportunity to discuss these issues, especially with Jason and Anas and Yvette. It's really exciting to be here with all of you. I mean, I think the bottom line is it's never been worse. I mean, one of the things that CPJ is known for, we're an organization of journalists. We've been around for over 3 decades. We use the tools of journalism to defend the rights of journalists around the world. And one of the things we're known for is our research, our reporting, and our data. And we've been systematically collecting data, for example, on journalists imprisoned around the world every year since 1992. The last 3 years are the highest we've ever seen, record numbers. We have data on journalists being killed around the world. Those numbers sort of wax and wane. They're more correlated to conflict. So we saw spikes during the Syria conflict, during the Iraq conflict, but they're consistently high. The level of violence has maintained at a very high level. So you look at those data points, and it's clear that the threat to journalists has never been greater. I think there are a couple, just stepping back, a couple of small points I want to make about that. First, most of the attacks and most of the violence and most of the persecution is directed towards local journalists working in their own countries who are reporting on things like human rights and corruption, abuse of power. Very often, these are local stories with global dimensions. But I think we have to think about the kind of information ecosystem in which we live, in which we exist, and that these reporters are our reporters. Censorship, just like information does not conform to borders, censorship as well. So censorship in one country, this kind of violence, this kind of repression, it actually impacts the ability of all of us to stay informed. So these journalists are not, they're part of our community. And they're part of our community as journalists, that's why we defend their rights, but as news consumers, as people who are citizens of the world. We need this information. Secondly, you know, at the time we're seeing these, you know, there are a lot of different reasons why we're seeing these spikes in violence and repression against journalists around the world. Some of them are complex and have to do with, you know, changes in the technology and how that's impacted the media ecosystem and the relationships that journalists have with you know, traditional employers. Many of these journalists are doing more innovative forms of journalism where they don't have the same kind of institutional backing. That's a challenge. But I think we also have to link it to the overall environment that's created by democratic leaders. There is nobody out there that is a forceful and powerful advocate for the rights of journalists and press freedom. To the contrary, we have leaders, especially like President Trump, who disparage, denigrate, diminish, demean the media every day. And while I'm loath to correlate that kind of language to specific attacks, there is some evidence, however, that the fake news rubric, the fake news framework, is actually being utilized by authoritarian leaders around the world to justify their own repression. There are new fake news laws on the book. Russia just passed one, Egypt. So you are seeing this rubric being adopted, and you're also seeing more journalists being jailed on fake news charges around the world. So this is definitely an issue. But the broader point is that, you know, at a time when journalists are more vulnerable and threatened than ever before, the kind of framework that allowed them to stand up and defend their rights is being undermined, not by authoritarian leaders, but by democratic leaders. And so I think you put all those pieces together, and we're really living through an unprecedented moment where the challenges have never been so acute.
Thank you for that overview and perspective, Joel. To bring it back to personal experiences and to bring in another whole community of journalists that you reference, communities working without the auspices of the protection of a Washington Post, and often on the front lines in ways that are hard for us to imagine. And such a person is with us today. Anas Awadina Anas is a Ghanaian lawyer, investigative journalist, and has his identity disguised today for obvious reasons. He is facing the kind of dangers, not only in terms of his personal safety, but that of his team almost every day as he goes about throughout the continent, but specifically in Ghana, went after a corruption scheme that really completely undid the soccer football association in that country, and for that came under enormous threats and attacks. And Anas, along with the personal issues of personal danger and safety that you're facing, can you share with us recently the loss of your co-founder for the Tiger Eye Foundation and this work?
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm happy to see some of my colleagues already seated. I think it started from Malawi, where we did a film called Malawi's Human Harvest, and it was a BBC Africa Eye program, and it was quite a difficult investigation, but very successful. We managed to film some people who were involved in killing of people for ritual purposes. And at a certain point in the investigation, they invited us to a particular location. Of course, when I say BBC, I mean all security protocol observed here. So we got in, and whilst interacting with these people and filming at the same time, we heard some noise around us, and we realized that it could have just been people in the neighborhoods. Now, these guys who were filming had decided to take us to places where they bury the dead whenever they kill them. Apparently, the community people had also noticed that over the years, this was the activity that was going on. So they had taken a decision that if they found anybody in that area, they were going to kill them. We had no knowledge of that, so we were working. And we saw about 30 people coming to ask us, why are you here? What are you doing? And we explained, of course, we told them who we were. They were okay. Then another 100, then 200. So, well, we have to kill you. And we are like, yeah, we're doing our job. We're not here. Said, no, anybody who comes here is a killer. We have to kill you. It was a terrible night for all of us. We did try to speak to them to tell them that we had not done anything, and they started attacking us. I recall Darius Zabajan, who came from the BBC, then was hit with a stone on his head. I could see blood coming, people throwing knives. But they were taking us through a journey. They said they wanted to take us to their chief, and if the chief gave them a final order, then they would decide on where to finally put our bodies. We got in there, got to the chief's palace after a long walk of stone throwing, knife throwing, and all that. Fortunately, when we got to the chief, he said he didn't want them to kill us, and that he wanted to speak to someone first before we were killed. So he took us to a room. Then the villagers started attacking the chief. At that time, we had already put in place, then our security details started coming into being because of the protocol. So the local MP and some other people came, shoved us into a vehicle, and we drove off. So we were home back in Ghana to celebrate how we had left. And that's the story of Ahmed. I was with him in this same investigation. We narrowly missed dying. So when we got back to Ghana, we celebrated. But before even going to Malawi, we had done Betraying the Game. Huge football story. Affected the World Cup. Affected the Confederation of African Football, many referees. Affected FIFA executive members or member. And then the president of the Ghana Football Association. Huge story. And we were going through the process because then the referees who were all removed by CAF, and then FIFA had to step in to remove Kwesi Nyantakyi as the executive, of course. Then legal suits will begin to come, what we normally get. But there was consistent threats on our lives while we were doing it. We took a lot of security precautions because we also felt that some of the people we had filmed were very close to government and were very powerful. So we needed to balance our security, look at what we can provide for ourselves, and also examine what government machinery can also give us. And of course, together with organizations like where my brother comes from. So we were in talks. One evening, I had gone to a hospital to visit a friend of mine's mom. It was around 10:30 in the evening, and I got a call. Ahmed, my colleague, had been shot. One in his neck and twice in his heart. And he was on his way to visit his family. We were devastated. It was a very painful moment for us. Of course, we always knew that there's a price to pay for what we do. But the nature and the manner of which, how it all happened, it was clear to us that it was premeditated murder because he was shot. The people followed up and shot him twice in his heart, making sure that he died. Difficult moments. I recall that night at around 1 a.m. I had to move all team to another location because we were confused. We didn't know when the next attack was going to come. And then at around 2 a.m., team decided that we have to be sure that Ahmed was dead. So we went to the morgue, looked at the body. We came back, and together with our colleagues from the BBC, my friend here, and other colleagues, we've soldiered on, despite the difficulty. We've always known that journalism has never been a tea party, and that there are hazards involved in our game. But what kept on tickling us was when people who give us money to strengthen our democracy publicly declare the work we do as fake news, publicly chastise journalists. That is the effect you get. Because you see, governments then feel that, well, if Donald Trump says they are fake and they know nothing, then we can kill them. So you may sit in the White House, say whatever you want to say. At the end of the day, the effect is on us. We die every day. Thank you.
Don't think it could have been more powerfully stated, the dilemma in which we find ourselves and us. Thank you for your work and for continuing it, given the way in which this means you have to go forward in your life. You also bring up that there are many, gratefully, many individuals around the world who have taken their activism, their advocacy, using the tools and technology of journalism to widen the access to facts, truth, and story. And Yvette, Alberdingk-Thijm, leads one such organization that trains these advocates and activists all over the world to use the tools of journalism. The organization is called Witness, very familiar to most of us at Skoll. So when you hear these stories, these are professional journalists working on the front lines, the dangers they are facing. How do you then bring citizen activists, citizen journalists into this profession?
Thank you, Pat. And it is, as Joel also said, I actually think this is an incredible panel to be part of, and with a lot of courage and a lot of insight being represented. The way I would think about it is that we're in this moment of a perfect storm, because the tools that journalism has used for a long time are now available to so many more people. So Witness, for the last 26 years, has always stood by people who would expose the truth and help them figure out tactics to actually make sure that the truth would lead to change in many different ways. One of the things that we see around the world, there are thousands of people turning to these tools, frequently a mobile phone that happens to be in your hand, whether you are an undocumented immigrant in Texas and you see ICE coming into your front door, or see Border Patrol violate people's rights, whether you live in a favela in Brazil right now, where the military and the police, since the Bolsonaro elections, are shooting straight from helicopters into the favelas next to schools. You are going to be documenting what's happening, but you may not actually have the tools to know how to protect yourself. Your story will definitely, in this perfect storm of fake news and misinformation, will be denied. Your credibility will vary by powerful people, particularly, as was noted, in illiberal democracies, will be immediately discredited. So I think in that sense we are working very in close connection with all the work that my colleagues here are doing, but I think we see it as there's a mass movement. I was asked to make a note of hope. There is a note of hope, which is there is the power of narrative, which is the strongest defense against these kind of authoritarian and populist regimes and the way they are ordering and creating all kinds of polarization. Many people actually are turning to these tools, but there's a gap that we absolutely have to address. Yeah.
And before we move to that, you brought us a video as well,
yeah,
to show that the dangers we've already heard, yeah, illustrated so compellingly exist for these activist journalist on the ground as well. So will you tell us what we are?
I think that I brought a video of an amazing land defender called Samir Flores Sobranes, who was killed on February 21st. This year he works in Mexico, and he was an incredible communicator. He got up every morning, as you'll see in the video, to use radio in his own community to alert people to the federal government's creation of a thermal dam project that would deeply affect the indigenous community that he was a part of. So I brought it particularly because in this Skoll community, I know many people are working on so many issues related to land rights, health, and across all these issues, people are turning to the tools of journalism to make sure that people know about what's going on. So, yeah.
Can we see the video now, please? Thank you for sharing that. There's just no question that Witness and other organizations that have taken the tools and technology of reporting what you're seeing on the ground, and the effect has been enormous. The thousands of people who, as you say, with their cell phones have documented injustice and corruption. How do you respond to the, not so much criticism, but fear, Yvette, that in putting so many journalists who go into these situations without the training of Jason and many of the others, or without the representation of press organizations like CPG and others, how do you prepare them?
Yeah, I think, as was mentioned, it's an ecosystem, right? Throughout the world, people are turning to these tools and they're using them. So there's no moment where we can reverse history and say, actually don't expose yourself. And besides, with silence comes impunity. So the only way to address the impunities of extractive industries and the injustices of hateful and discriminatory narratives is to get the stories out. So at Witness, and there are many other organizations who are doing amazing work on this around the world, we try to work as closely as we can. We've increased a lot of the digital and security and safety tools that we share with people, but we also work in a broader systemic way in terms of trying to address sort of the sources of false and fake news, because there's a lot of ways in which if you're a favela activist, for example, and you are filming and you call yourself a media activist, that your account on Facebook will immediately be discredited, there will be a fake identity created, so which creates a whole other layer of risk when you're actually speaking out. When you are actually sharing stories, very frequently the algorithms that are being introduced by the tech giants are going to delete your story. So there's a larger system that we have to very carefully take into account to address this problem, which, as we've all said, is a Is it
Joel, I think you want to get into
Yeah, I
this.
mean, I think also there's an onus on us as journalists to expand our definition of what journalism is and to make it as inclusive as we possibly can, and also to recognize that journalists don't have special rights for the most part. We work in a kind of broad framework that protects freedom of expression, including of non-traditional forms of communication. So I think that journalism, work that journalists do depends on these systems working, and it depends on these individuals. I worked as a journalist for many years in Mexico, so this story really resonates with me. If you are a journalist, this is where you get your information from. They are the kind of, this information ecosystem. It starts with people like this journalist. I consider him a journalist working in his own community, documenting that reality and suffering the consequences. But I just also want to make a broader point about how we respond and engage with the specific challenges. First of all, we need a kind of bottom-up, innovative approach, recognizing that we have to use technology itself to expand opportunities for storytelling, for information gathering, for participating in this kind of journalistic activity, and recognize that there are new forms of doing this. Recognize also that the technology that has empowered all these people is being weaponized against us by states and companies. We have massive risk of surveillance. Governments are using this. Jason talked about, first thing they did when they arrested him, they wanted his passwords. This is absolutely standard practice. Social networks can be engineered for positive change. They can also be reverse engineered by governments to engage in sweeping crackdowns. All the information that is available on your social media network used to be things that governments would arrest you and torture you to get. Now they just get your password. They know who you're talking to. They know what your opinions are. And we have to also recognize the threat of surveillance. And the second thing we need to do, I think, is we need to innovate, and we need to create new spaces for storytelling and creative journalism. And we need to push back fiercely and intensely against the new strategies of repression. So push back against governments that are committing violence, engaging in repression, but also creating the rhetorical space that allows for this repression to occur, allows for the Saudi government to murder a Washington Post columnist without facing repercussions, allows for the murder of a Ghanaian journalist with impunity, allows for the arrest and imprisonment of 2 Reuters correspondents in Myanmar who broke ground, reported on a vitally important story for the world about violence being committed against the Rohingya community. So we have a lot of work to do, but there are avenues to challenge the threats that are inhibiting the flow of information in this current moment.
I know there are many of you eager to get into this conversation, and I'm going to go there in just a minute, but I can feel your energy here that in this ecosystem where we have to push back, there is no question, we are dealing with new tools, new algorithms, technologies, and how is this playing out in your life as
Well, I mean, it makes, as Joel said, it makes it possible for us as individuals, as reporters, to have more tools at our availability to tell stories. But there are also powerful forces with the same tools and more resources in holding us back. So, I like to see that there is a sort of camaraderie and growing community around this. It doesn't matter what one's politics are. If you believe in the individual's right to expression and the protection of those rights, that crosses over borders, ethnicities, religions, and everything else.
Right.
And so, I'm glad to be up here with allies.
And there are some solutions represented in the audience. Before going there, Anas, how is this in your work? The fake news, all the new threats that are coming, as well as personal safety dangers.
The pushback is real. I mean, it's an everyday occurrence. And this time, it doesn't even come only in the form of legal suits and others. the traditional ones. We have digital platforms that people set up just to ensure that whatever information you have doesn't even come out. Right. So we have formed alliances with colleagues from Sweden, Clarity, where we have a solid digital platform which is impenetrable and which serves as a tool for us to always add on. This helps us to put our information, apart from putting it locally, to put our information there. And since we started with this Je suis un as page, it's been very difficult to be able to hack or take the information we put out there. We're also considering a major, but the biggest crisis we face today is the digital one, because we are used to the normal threat and we find our way around it. But the digital one is really, and I've been speaking to colleagues in some other African countries who are also learning from our Je suis un as platform and who are also looking forward to get the opportunity to have such solid platform so that nobody would take your information down in a second. And this are even done by governments, so it can really be problematic.
And in this new reality we're all living in, a lot of people in this room are thinking about this deeply and coming up with solutions. Jess, are you in the room from Doc Society? You recently have launched an initiative directly addressing this.
Thank you. Is it on? Is it going? Yeah. Thank you for the panel, all of you, each of you, just really amazing contributions. I just agreed with everything that everybody said. And we spoke last night, Joel, and I was really happy to hear then what you said now about being so inclusive about who you're seeing coming under the umbrella, and what Yvette is saying about who uses the tools of journalism. I work with independent documentary filmmakers, and they sometimes identify as journalists, as we discussed, and often don't. They're like, I don't know, close cousins or something, but certainly use the tools of journalism. And all these same dynamics are playing out, in their lives and in their work. One of the things that we've kind of picked up and been thinking about, and I was curious to see what the panel thought about that, is I think we've learned obviously the massive importance of networks and community to protect individuals, which obviously has been well spoken about. But I feel like two things really have struck us, and one is we were radically under-lawyered, that actually often independent people, it's an expense. They don't necessarily know those people in their networks. They don't have a friend lawyer they can go to, and so they don't really, it just seems like impenetrable and expensive, and they tend to leave it until it's way too late or they're already in the shit, and then rush around trying to find someone, whereas they could have been much better advised before. So we're doing a lot to try and connect filmmakers at the beginning with lawyers, and I wonder how that's playing out in your context. And the other was the mental health piece, which I feel like it's sort of a new moment when actually our filmmakers are being really honest for the first time about the trauma and the PTSD that they've been suffering, which perhaps they didn't speak about because they thought it made them seem unprofessional or what have you. And then kind of that really revealing the mountain of work of how do we support people in that way, as well as like the lawyer and the community. And I wondered how that's playing out for you guys.
Yeah, let's take both those questions. Yvette, do you want to pick up on certainly on the personal one, where you have these strong personal relationships with the journalist who works with witness?
Of course, and thanks, Jess. And a quick note on the mental health piece. It's a huge, important piece that needs to be owned. If you're a funder, if you're not taking that into account what you're funding, you're actually doing harm. It's been very much in technology. It's been a notion that you do no harm, but if you're funding people to be in certain situations and there's no way that they have access to a consultant for their mental health, or if they have the right benefits, then there's an issue there. And I'm very happy we're part of a larger initiative that thinks about sustainable practices. I wanted to kind of make one specific comment on the sort of the way that technology is impacting this. So everything we do at Witness is deeply in collaboration with grassroots communities. And one of the things we started to do is look at what we call emerging threats and opportunities. So which we believe, for example, Adobe just came out with a new video product that allows you to delete any object from that video. So that means that this entire world of witnessing, of journalism, you can just take anything out of a video, right? And these tools are getting really mainstreamed right now. So in our new initiative, we're actually really thinking about, there's another notion that's called deep fakes. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but basically it means that any person's voice or image video can be completely simulated through synthetic media, through manipulated media. So if
Yvette, give us an example. You shared a couple with me.
Well, I'm sure you've seen the Jordan Peele Obama video where you see Obama talking. Now imagine that that video actually is Maria Ressa, who's an amazing Philippine journalist doing incredible work, admitting to all the crimes she's completely unjustly being accused of. Or imagine that that is Aung San Suu Kyi asking for people to take action against certain ethnic minorities. So we're bringing together both private sector groups like Adobe and researchers and tech developers and journalists and bringing in the voices of the people who are marginalized and who are very frequently going to bear the biggest brunt of all these kinds of developments, to start really thinking about solutions. There are great organizations like First Draft, for example, who's doing really good work on that, the MIT Media Lab. There's good thinking about it, but we need to be prepared, not just panic, and really think about what are the solutions. So as a first step, we've started to really bring together a very unusual group of stakeholders to start thinking about what are the potential solutions.
I sort of panic when we go from fake to deep fake.
Yeah.
Yeah. Joel?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond directly to Jess's question. First about legal support. Yes, it's vital, but it's complicated because legal support is generally not one size fits all, and a lot of the threats are in places where there is no rule of law. So, Jason mentioned, revolutionary courts. We've actually worked with media organizations when their correspondents, for example, have had legal troubles in Iran. It's very hard to find a lawyer these days that's first of all going to take the case, and that second of all is it's not really going to be adjudicated in the court. Right. So we work in a lot of places around the world where the rule of law is functionally non-existent, and the defense is not really about legal defense, it's about some broader applying political pressure. That being said, everyone needs a lawyer, and there are certain circumstances where specialized legal defense is what's required, and what's really wonderful is there are these new emerging informal and formal networks of lawyers, and people come to us and we put them in touch and we find people the legal help they need, either through organizations like the Media Law Defense Initiative, which is based here in London, or through these more informal networks. On mental health and trauma support, let me just say that within the industry, within the media industry, and maybe Jason, you can speak to this in a more personal way, I'm seeing a real shift in the way newsrooms think about this and the kind of support that they provide, the kind of peer counseling, kind of external support, the kind of framework that they create for people who need this kind of support. The problem is scaling that, and pushing it out into these more informal structures I've talked about. There are people doing that work. It's really vital, but I think there's the greatest challenge. How do you push that kind of support out into environments where there aren't these kinds of structures and resources? And also, there could be cultural resistance to providing this kind of support.
So I want to make one quick point on the legal stuff first. Joel's right. I mean, in a lot of places, it doesn't matter if you have a lawyer, right? I had a lawyer in Iran, and the Washington Post paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to represent me, and I met that person one time and wasn't able to really interact with them. But I think that one thing that we can all do a better job of is a very basic tenet of most of our Western legal codes, is the presumption of innocence, right? And so often when these cases are first reported in the news, it's talking about all the egregious accusations that are being made against the journalists. And I think we need to be more cautious about that. And right off the bat say, oh, this person is being held on what appear to be bogus charges from day one, right? So that we don't have to kind of work our way back. How many times does a journalist in Iran or Turkey or Egypt or, how many times does Maria Ressa need to get arrested for us to just say, hey, this is BS, right? So that's one point on that. On the mental health bit, I've been really fortunate, and I think that's because I work for an organization that not only has a lot of resources, but also has a deep history of being sort of a caring family type organization. So there's a real concern for our physical and mental well-being, but so much more needs to be done. And in the wake of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, I mean, being in the Washington Post newsroom and watching how that unfolded, I think that there are lots and lots of younger journalists that are covering parts of the world that they've never seen or touched from a newsroom in a major metropolitan city, and all of a sudden these realities are coming back into our newsrooms, and I think we need to do a better job of being prepared for that, because as wonderful as the work is that everybody up here is doing, I don't think any of us believes that there aren't going to be more cases that we have to deal with in the short term.
And this conversation is taking a pivot to bring all of us in, because it is really ultimately all of our responsibility, as well as an issue that is greatly important for us as consumers of news and information, and for whom we depend upon that. So other questions? Yes. Please do wait for the mic. And
I think Anas wanted to chime in.
Yes, Anas, I'll come back just a moment.
Jeannie Burgo with Internews, and agree with everything that's said on the panel, and a couple of other giant systemic pressures against freedom of expression. One is sort of overt government censorship, including going as far as shutting down the internet, which shuts everything down in all forms of communications. And coupled with that, the collapse of the business model to support media all around the world means that communicators can't make a living doing this at that local level. So I would say that all of this is just making for an incredibly difficult environment for us, for consumers everywhere, to get information. Just a comment.
Thank you for that. Just 1 second. Anas wanted to comment on the previous point.
Your comment on legals makes me a bit uncomfortable, because you see, the latest way of government getting to clamp down journalists is using the legal system. And we cannot sit here and assume that because some of the systems are failed, we are not going to get legal representation. We should have it. The reasons are this simple. Because even though systems may look like they are failed systems and that whatever you do is not going to happen, if we move away from always engaging and telling EDPO lawyers to speak to journalists, when EDPO here means editorial policy lawyers of our news organizations. So if you work with the BBC, you work with Al Jazeera, and something happens in your country, they say, okay, we have our lawyers, let them keep talking to you. Of course, it means nothing to us. It means nothing. But if we were to move a step further, and to say that, let us go get local lawyers to deal with the local issue, then we are making an impact. I have gotten over 40 legal suits just for the team to even feel confident that we have legal representation. That alone awakens us and gives our spirit back to us. It puts us in a more combatant move to be able to fight the system. If we do a blanket approach and say, well, it's a failed state, whatever you do, government is still going to say they are guilty. It's not the way out. We need to get our spirits back. We need to feel that, yes, whatever we are saying, we need to have records of what we have said. Pitch it against what government wants to use to imprison. Then at the end of the day, we'll have some precedents. That's what I think should. The legal bit is quite serious, because it's the latest way of clamping all of us down. It's happening in Nigeria, it's happening in Kenya, it's happening in South Africa, it's happening everywhere. Like I said, I repeat myself again, the best way of dealing with this is not to fly your lawyers from London or the US. Get local lawyers and they will fix it.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely, I agree, and I wanted to make sure that clarify the point. Absolutely, Maria Ressa is an example. She's obvious in the Philippines. She's fighting these legal charges. We and many other groups around the world are supporting her with local legal defense, which is what she requires. The point I was making was only that in certain environments, you have to combine the legal defense with the kind of active political defense. because it's not going to be simply settled in the courtroom. That's the point I was
We have
making.
less than 15 minutes left, so I'm going to take 3 questions at one time. There were 2 hands here and 1 here, so let's take your question. All right, well then let's move over here. And I'll come back.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Christy Hegornis, Global Press. I'm so thrilled to see journalist security elevated to this level at Skoll this year, so thank you for that. At Global Press, we employ more than 200 female journalists in least covered markets around the world, and one of the ways we're able to successfully do that is by operating a robust, holistic duty of care that includes physical, emotional, digital, and legal security for every journalist in our network. I'm interested, Anas, following up on your point, and also from you, Joel, you've indicated that local journalists we know are in so much more danger, but yet security parity in the industry remains an issue. I'm interested in what responsibility we think news organizations have towards the local journalists, translators, and fixers that they rely on to get the news out.
An extraordinary work that you do, and thank you for that. Joel?
Did you want to go first?
Well, I think that, if you were working with a local organization, for example, in Kenya, yeah, you expect your organization to help. It's not much help that will come. So it is yourself also to start thinking of how do I protect myself if I come out with a story. Elevate it to the bigger scale where you are working with the international, an international organization. You see, we've now learned to negotiate our security in whatever independent production we are having in nowadays. We've learned that if we talk about our security and insurance, we ought to also argue. It used not to be like that. They used to just parachute in, come and use you, dump you, and then go away. But now we are saying that before I append my signature to any film that you want me to do, I want to ask, how are you going to take care of me if there should be any danger? And we are trying to spread this across the African continent and the world as well for other colleagues. And we are not talking about just journalists on the front line, but we are talking about our fixers and our entire team. So it's going to be slow, but because, you see, it's also a push against losing that contract because you are not careful. Al Jazeera or BBC or Channel 4 will say, well, you are pushing too much. I don't want you to. It means that we should hire someone else. It's a delicate conflict, but I believe that we have to keep pushing the frontier. It will be gradual, but we will get there. And I think that there should be forums like this where we tell organizations like the big ones that, listen, if you were to sign any contract with any journalist, inculcate in that plan how to save his life, how to take care of him if there should be any trouble.
Such an important message. Yvette, I think about you and Witness and the responsibilities that you feel and are taking new measures to implement.
I just wholeheartedly agree with what Anas just said. So, for example, since the Bolsonaro elections, many of the activists that we very closely partner with, including obviously our own team in Brazil, are facing incredibly additional threats that are very specific to that situation. And we just happen to have a little bit of extra money that we just coincidentally got, really. And we are just deeply grateful that we have it, because now we can start to really up the already very tight security, and not just for ourselves, but also for our partners, because that is usually the thing, to Anas's point, that actually gets forgotten, right? Like it's a duty of care, and you have to actually do it. And there is no such thing as absolute security, but there's all kinds of things that you can do in terms of secure communication, secure technology, taking people sometimes out of a country for a while. Mental health and tech security are very closely related also. And we're seeing some funders starting to step up into that, but it needs to be really married to each other.
Yeah, and again, I want to say, I think that part of the challenge, because I'm seeing like traditional media organizations with resources taking more responsibility for their teams, which is positive. I just wrote a book about kidnapping, and so I've been looking into, one of the terrible things is like there's kidnapping and ransom insurance, but it often doesn't cover your local people. Well, there are some media organizations that have been working on renegotiating the policy so that it does, so they are taking responsibility. So I see some positive things happening there. The challenge, I think, is just how, because CPJ comes in, we sometimes are dealing with sort of cleaning up the mess, and how informal these relationships are. So someone who's working as a freelancer who doesn't have an assignment goes into a pretty dangerous place, hires some local journalist who hires a taxi driver, and that thing goes off the rails. I've seen that happen. And that's where the structures really don't respond, and we step in and we try and do what we can. But I think the part of the challenge is just how informal some of these relationships are, and where the relationships are informal, it's more difficult to impose structures that are going to respond when things go bad, which happens.
And there's the ever-evolving role of government, and this as well. I mean, just reflecting on my work in El Salvador many, many years ago, we were told specifically not to register at the American Embassy because they didn't want to know when we showed up dead. Didn't want to know we'd been in the country. So that's a situation which many independent journalists in particular are facing today. So were there other questions? We have about 10 minutes, and if there are, there's one over here. Brenda?
Thank you so much, Brenda Coughlin with Sundance Institute. And Anas just raised with contracts, and you just with insurance. We're seeing 10, 15, 20,000 artists are coming through a year through the Sundance programs, plus the story protagonists and subjects of their films and the communities and the people that they work with locally. And insurance is a very boring and unsexy topic that is incredibly a structural issue for us because, as you said, it doesn't socialize the risk. The risk is all put back and the burden is all sent back onto the individual filmmaker. And at the scale that we're operating on, that is, as you've all pointed out, a completely untenable situation. So here with all these amazing social entrepreneurs in the room, we're interested in what are the structural large-scale solutions we can bring, even particularly to the insurance industry, for any of you who are interested in that. But I'm also interested to hear from the panel because you've had such an interesting combination of local organizing and political solutions and structural ones. So if there are people in the room and others throughout the forum, that is where our brain is now. So, but again, thank you, particularly Jason and us, for coming and being here.
Any responses to the insurance question? Or is it something that CPG is spending some time thinking about?
Yeah, no, it's yes. I mean, I think it's overcoming the structures that I described. Also, remember that for things like safety, there are some low-cost things that you can do. We have a correspondent in India who's been traveling throughout the country, meeting with local press clubs, trying to get them, journalists in local communities, to think more about their digital and information security, and that's relatively inexpensive and something that often journalists can do on their own. But other kinds of risk mitigation around health insurance or around that may not be available in many parts of the world, and employers are not, media organizations in some countries just simply don't provide it to their employees, or they have networks of freelancers, some local journalist in some community who's technically a freelancer. So, I mean, there are a lot of structural challenges to extending insurance and these kinds of protections deeper into this information ecosystem that I described. Absolutely.
Sort of last opportunity for a question or a comment before asking the panel for some wrap-up thoughts. Yes.
Hello, good morning. My name is Salman Sheikh. Thank you for all the panelists. Jason, I've followed your work for a very long time. I had something called the Sheikh Group. We try to empower people themselves in Middle East conflict zones to make peace and to build peace. I was a personal friend of Jamal Khashoggi when I headed Brookings, Doha. We had him often. coming and speaking, as well as friends like Mary Colvin, Gibran Twaini, the people who have been killed just pursuing their work. Now, let me borrow from Syria for a second. It's the most maybe photographed conflict perhaps in recent history on social media, and yet we haven't been able to make a difference. Isn't it the ecosystem? Isn't it that we rely on states, that we rely on the UN? And I used to work for the UN for 10 years. Isn't it that overall climate that's being created, where journalists who are in the front lines you're the canary in the coal mines, but it's also now to do with academic freedoms. It's to do with people being able to express themselves in these situations, in these conflicts, in order to find solutions. Thank you.
It sort of brings us back to the essential question of what difference can we make? Yvette.
I have a very quick answer to your question. Obviously, political will and the Syrian conflict, we're not going to be able to resolve that single-handedly. However, for example, we've worked with people like the Syrian Archive to start to collect millions of pieces of video and photos to at least make sure that the documentation is preserved and accessible. Then we created a methodology to do that we are working with the Rohingya community with right now, with Rohingya Vision, to also preserve 80% of the ethnic cleansing was caught on WhatsApp. We're now working with different people to do the same in Yemen. We did it in Ukraine, and we're creating a police violence database in the US. So I think there is an opportunity to look at the volume of information and to turn it into impact. The first cases are starting to come out of verified and preserved videos and social media videos, particularly against some of the perpetrators in Syria. It's a very tiny glimmer of hope, but that's probably the way forward.
Well, I think the point he's trying to make is that sometimes we assume we are in some beautiful ecosystem and it must work. And sometimes it does not work. And Syria is a typical example. Maybe it's about time we amend our notes and say that, yes, there is an ecosystem, but the ecosystem should not remain at lip service. We should ensure that we always push the frontiers and take on CPJ. I am not happy about his answer to insurance because I'm a journalist. I think they can do better. I know when I sit with him, he's going to say, well, we are not getting enough funds. We all have little problems, but maybe this whole idea of ecosystem, which is a great start, we should also have mechanisms to check and ensure whether this ecosystem actually works at all. And if it doesn't, how do we help hold each other's hands and push this system forward?
And are there specific suggestions, Anas, that you would bring forward based on your experience?
That's the point I'm making, that my brother is from CPJ, my sister is here. We should be able to tell them in their face when they go wrong, because we are the journalists and we face it every day. And I've made lots of comments here where I think that sometimes the interventions are this late. They don't come on time. Sometimes they are not able to support budgets up to a particular instant. And I have records where we have written to express danger, where they've said, okay, we can only take you to Kenya, where we have said that no, but Kenya to that same danger that exists. So I think it's a general question that we all ought to look at, because based on the reasons they give, you cannot blame them too, because you can understand that there are procedures that one ought to take care of. But a complete assumption that there is an existing ecosystem that must embrace and help anybody is not going to take us anywhere. We have to ensure that we all take steps, no matter how small it is, to ensure that we oil this ecosystem with the needed funds and tech it needs to move. Thank you.
I can't think of a better way to end this panel than that one, and to say that it is because we are all worried about that ecosystem and all the parts in which it is threatened and all the dangers that are between us and what we need to know and to sustain free and open societies. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. This one's going to continue for some time to come. Thank you.